Thưa quý vị, trong thời gian chưa đầy 2 tuần thì một video trên YouTube đã đạt được lượng người xem là lên đến 2,8 triệu. Điều thú vị là video này lại không phải là của ca sĩ nổi tiếng hot boy hay là hot girl nào, mà là của anh Dan Hauer, một người Mỹ đang dạy tiếng Anh ở Hà Nội. Với tựa đề Khi người Mỹ nghe tiếng Anh của người Việt, video đã chỉ ra một số lỗi phát âm tiếng Anh thường gặp, kể cả ở người học có trình độ cao.
How much that is cost. Nhớ này. How much that is cost.
How much that is cost.
How much dice cups?
No, he's trying to say how much does it cost?
Oh, that's not what I.
All right.
I'm deeply into you. I'm deeply into you.
I'm definitely into you. Is that what you got?
Well, yeah, I mean, she's almost saying doubly, but yeah.
She's trying to say I'm deeply into you.
Oh.
Really?
Upon your birthday, dreams and wishes come true.
June 10th?
Home Jom. I don't know.
She's trying to say I hope all your birthday dreams and wishes come true.
Really?
Vâng, thưa quý vị, video này thực sự là khiến cho Cẩm Tú và có lẽ là không ít người xem khác cũng cảm thấy khá là hoang mang và hơi mất tự tin vào khả năng nói tiếng Anh của mình. Vì thấy rằng là việc phát âm tiếng Anh sao mà khó, sao mà phức tạp quá. Học tiếng Anh bao lâu mà phát âm người bản ngữ lại nghe không hiểu thì thật là nản, đúng không quý vị? Và rất là may mắn là ngày hôm nay thì có một người bạn của chúng tôi là anh Neil, là giảng viên tiếng Anh tại Hội đồng Anh thành phố Hồ Chí Minh đã đến tham gia một cuộc trò chuyện về nỗi ám ảnh phát âm tiếng Anh cũng như là góp vài lời khuyên để chúng ta có thể hoàn thiện kỹ năng này. Good morning, Mr. Man. Welcome and thank you for joining us for this talk about English pronunciation.
Thank you. A pleasure to be here.
So could you introduce yourself to our audience?
My name is Neil Mann. I'm the senior teacher for adults at the British Council in Ho Chi Minh City. I've been living in Vietnam on and off for around about 8 years now, both in Ho Chi Minh City and in Hanoi.
Thanks. So let's begin. But before we start, could you do me a favor?
Of course.
Could you ask my smartphone to show me some photos of dogs?
Okay.
You know, the smartphone seems to hate me. Whenever I try to find some photos of dogs, it just showed me ducks.
Show me pictures of dogs.
Well, you made it.
I'm pleased. If I'm presenting myself as the expert, I hope I can get some of these ones right.
Well, yeah, that's amazing because, you know, I never thought that I would have problems pronouncing such, simple words such as dogs and ducks, ships and sheeps.
Well, one of the interesting things about why kind of Vietnamese learners often have problems with Vietnamese, with English pronunciation is that the languages are just so different. You know, I mean, English comes from a kind of Euro-Indo-European kind of family of languages, whereas Vietnamese comes from a more kind of Sino-Asian kind of family of languages, and the rules and the conventions of Vietnamese pronunciation and English pronunciation are so fundamentally different that's why many Vietnamese learners do have such problems. Even with things that you think must be quite simple, there can still be issues with them.
Yeah, I also found out that it's not only my problem, but the problem of many English learners. So let's watch this video with me.
A sheep on a sheep.
A sheep on a sheep.
Oi, 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 oi. A sheep on a sheep.
A sheep on the sheep.
A sheep on a sheep.
A sheep on a ship.
I love your duck.
I love your ducks.
I love your dogs.
I love your ducks.
3 trees.
3 trees. 3 trees.
3 trees.
And now I'm really nervous because have I made a lot of pronunciation mistakes so far?
I think your pronunciation has been very, very good so far. I'm very impressed.
Thank you so much. It's nice to hear.
If we think about, some of the examples in those videos, so for example, our sheep and our ship sound, that's a very common error for some Vietnamese learners when we're talking about things like the length of the vowel sounds. So when we have the sheep with our kind of wide mouth and our extended sound there versus the ship with a very, very short sound that we have there.
Like ship and sheep.
Exactly, with that nice kind of smile as you do it as well, for the kind of lots of teeth and a big long sound there for sheep. The other interesting one is the ducks and the dogs one. The two final sounds are the issue there, which is again is a very common problem for Vietnamese learners. But one of the issues there is that the g and the k sounds are paired phonemes, so we express those sounds exactly the same way in our mouth. The only difference is how much air we're pushing out. So when we say ducks, we're pushing out a little bit of air. When we're saying dogs, no particular air is coming out there. So just small changes in the way that Vietnamese learners say some of these sounds can have a really big difference.
So what do you think it's about English pronunciation that makes it so difficult for learners? Is it because it has no rules?
There are rules. I guess people aren't so familiar with them, which is maybe the problem. I think the first thing to think about is that they are very different in their rhythm and their timing, English and Vietnamese. Vietnamese is what we call a syllable-timed language, whereby when you add more syllables to a sentence, the length of the sentence increases. English, on the other hand, is a stress-timed language, and that means that the only real important words in the sentence are the stressed words, the words that give us meaning. So that can be one of the big differences and why some Vietnamese learners don't sound very natural when they speak, because they're stressing every single syllable in a sentence. And for a native speaker, that sounds a bit strange.
But how important is the correct pronunciation? You know, my smartphone may misunderstand what I said, but would you and other native speakers still understand if I use the wrong sound or I stress the wrong words?
I think a lot of it is to do with familiarity. So for me, I've lived in Vietnam a long time. I'm very familiar with some of the problems that Vietnamese learners have. So I think I would be quite happy or be able to understand most of the things that most learners say. But I think a lot of the reason that learners, and particularly Vietnamese learners, are keen to learn English is for things like going to study abroad or working in an international environment. Now, in those kind of places, people who are listening to Vietnamese learners aren't going to be so familiar with their mistakes. So that's kind of when it can cause problems. The kind of small errors in pronunciation can have a big effect on communication. But there are quite a lot of differences in terms of some of the sounds that we produce, the phonemes we would call them. Another aspect of kind of Vietnamese pronunciation that is a frequent area is what we call final sounds. Vietnamese tends to aspirate or produce the clearest sounds at the beginnings of words, whereas English will often produce the clearest sounds towards the end of the words. So I think if you were to ask any teacher of English in Vietnam what the most kind of common problem that Vietnamese learners have, they would probably say something like the final sounds on words, particularly when we're thinking about third person S's. So when we say, for example, he needs or she wants, that's probably the most common error for Vietnamese learners, is not making that final sounds in words clear.
Well, some of us, you know, Vietnamese have pointed out that English has been spoken in many accents around the world. You know, like Indian people have their own way to pronounce some English words, and so as Singaporean people, like, have you ever heard of Hinglish, Singlish, or Spanglish or something like that?
Fui al store a comprar some bananas, pero ya estaban sold out.
Yeah, 一杯 Daisy 燒大特包。嗱，不用醫啦，你要醫咩 ？Crazy 屈流嘅，不用咪叫我買得醫啦。喂，都買得咩啊？講買得啦，那要咩？咩啦？要不？
Hello, my name is Anbu and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I wanted to, introduce the Indian accent to you.
I think for us, especially for someone like me who's very interested in languages in the field of language study, that the whole, the Singlish, the Vinglish, the Spanglish, all these things, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
I mean, languages are living things. You know, they evolve and they change over time, and often become completely different over the space of, you know, of a few generations. One of the kind of great things about working in the kind of English language field is that you get to see this kind of evolution. And having been in Vietnam for around about 8 years now, the kind of difference in the kind of levels of English that people are using and the kind of everyday use of English really has changed. And one of the kind of interesting aspects of this is how much kind of technology and business have kind of started to have more kind of English being used in those fields in Vietnam. It's a great thing. I mean, why not? It's a kind of, I think it just kind of shows that Vietnam and Vietnamese people in particular have embraced English, and they see the value in using it, and they want to develop them. And you know, English is not a closed book. You know, English is kind of changed by all the places that it's. And I'm sure, you know, in a few generations' time, if the enthusiasm for English continues in Vietnam, we will definitely be recognising Vinglish as a real thing.
Yeah.
I think language is fundamentally about communication. So can you get your message across to another person?
Yeah.
And that's really what it boils down to, I think. So specifically Vietnamese ways of pronouncing things, of putting together grammar or things like that, if they're being used between two people who understand, that's fine. The only kind of issues you have is when you go kind of beyond that environment and you're trying to use words that only work within Vietnam in a kind of slightly more kind of international context. Again, common mistake. So we think about the first guy that we saw, how much does it cost? So we talked about making sure that we had that final sound with the S there. And then that kind of lack of connected speech that we might have. I think more of a kind of fundamental problem with production of specific sounds, I think, and that made it very, very difficult to understand. Say that when you're first learning English, you're first learning about pronunciation, you should be focusing on the sounds, the specific phonemes and the specific way that your mouth makes these different sounds. What we would say for more kind of advanced learners and learners who've been interacting with English for a fairly long time is that they should be focusing much more on what we call the features of pronunciation. So these are things like stress and connected speech and intonation and that sort of thing. So a lot of the kind of pronunciation teaching depends where you are on your journey in English. You know, when you're first starting out, you should be focusing much more on individual sounds and words, and then as you progress, thinking about a bit more about kind of pronunciation over sentence level. So
Just mentioned connected speech. I guess that's a problem for many Vietnamese when speaking English. So you know, we don't have this kind of connected speech in Vietnam, so it's really hard for us. So, but do we still can be understood if we speak English without using connected speech?
yes, I mean, of course, if you're careful with your speaking and you're producing things very kind of accurately, of course you'll be understood. Like we said, it's all about that kind of communication of message. But I think a lot of the desires of Vietnamese students are around sounding native level, I'd call it. And connected speech is a kind of fundamental aspect of speaking English. I mean, if I was to give you an example, so if I said something like da-da, da-da, now within just on its own there, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It has no particular meaning. But the sounds that we're producing there, if I put them into a sentence and I said, I'm going to the park, I'm going to the park. Now what we've got there is examples of how we link things together, and how we also use words that are stressed, in this sentence going park, and words that are not stressed, to and the, which we'd say very quickly and would connect together as much as we could.
I think that whenever we are not sure, we should play it safe and not use connected speech.
I think it's not so much if you're not sure. I mean, I think it more big to do with kind of how confident you are with the language. I think you'll meet plenty of people who have had no kind of formal learning, who just kind of pick things up through lots of interaction with foreigners, with native speakers, and they have fantastic examples of connected speech and weak forms and intonation. But if you were to ask them to, for example, do a grammar test, they would be not very kind of confident and wouldn't be so successful with that. So I think if you know, when you're starting out learning English, try as much as you can to understand how these things work. And be confident. And again, it doesn't matter if you're making any mistakes. As long as you're trying, as long as you're getting your message across, that's really the key when it comes to pronunciation, I think.
So I guess here comes the part that all of us are looking forward to. Can you give us some advice to improve our English pronunciation?
I think there's a few aspects to this, and maybe the first one, which I think is an issue for a lot of Vietnamese learners, is the confidence issue. A lot of them kind of think that English is difficult and I'll never learn this, and I need to just be very precise when I'm using my language. But that's really not the case. I mean, we want our learners and our students to be as confident as possible, and not worry about making mistakes. The second thing I think would be to use the language as much as you can. It sounds like a crazy bit of advice, but when, for example, learners are using videos like that, it's much more of a passive way of learning. They're just listening to somebody producing different sounds, producing different words, which is fine. You know, it's good for your listening and so on. But when you're learning in that passive way, just listening, you're not producing anything. You're not being an active learner. So what we need to think about with pronunciation is trying to actually produce the sounds as often as possible, and to interact with somebody else in English as much as possible. And maybe kind of 5 or 10 years ago, it would have been very difficult to find people to practice with in English. But these days, I mean, there's such a big drive for English in Vietnam that there are people and students and business people and things like that who are all learning, and we get asked all the time, well, who can I practice my speaking or pronunciation with? We talked a little bit about kind of stress. I think that would be one of the key things for Vietnamese learners to get their heads around. So moving away from every word being clear and pronounced clearly as it is in Vietnamese, to understanding that in English only the words that carry meaning are important, and that when we have those words that carry that meaning, we say them clearly, we have that slightly longer length in the syllables of them, and everything else isn't particularly important, what we call the functional or grammatical words. So
Thank you so much for your great advice, and I believe that they will help our audience a lot in improving their English pronunciation. So before this show is over, would you like to say something to our audience?
Well, I mean, I think my big thing, and I've said a couple of times, is that one of the great things about being in Vietnam is how much of a focus Vietnam and Vietnamese people have on education. And obviously English education is one of the big aspects of that. So I would say that be confident with your English, don't worry about making mistakes, and just as much as you can, just try to interact with English as a language. We're very lucky now in Vietnam in that we can access lots of different movies and television and music and radio shows. So do try to interact with English as much as you can, even if all it is listening to Taylor Swift for 3 minutes when you get home, or watching American Idol, or anything. Even stuff like that can help you to improve your English on a kind of everyday basis.
So that's it for today. Once again, thank you so much for joining us in the show.
Thank you too.
Thưa quý vị, chúng ta vừa có một cuộc trò chuyện rất là lý thú về vấn đề học phát âm tiếng Anh cùng với thầy Mailman, và Cẩm Tú tin rằng là trong lúc trao đổi với thầy thì chắc chắn là Cẩm Tú cũng đã không tránh khỏi việc mắc những cái lỗi phát âm, nhưng mà như cuộc trò chuyện đã cho thấy thì chúng ta luôn có thể rèn luyện để phát âm ngày càng chuẩn hơn và hay hơn, đúng không ạ? Và những lời khuyên của thầy Man thì chắc chắn là sẽ rất là có ích cho quý vị khán giả cũng như là chính bản thân Cẩm Tú trong quá trình này. Và đến đây thì thời lượng của chương trình cũng đã hết. Mời quý vị truy cập vào báo Thanh Niên theo địa chỉ thanniên.vn và đăng ký kênh YouTube của báo Thanh Niên để xem những chương trình khác cũng như là để cập nhật những thông tin mới nhất. Và bây giờ thì Cẩm Tú xin chào tạm biệt và hẹn gặp lại quý vị.